Hi everybody, my name is Brooke Reavey. I am a current senior Fulbright Scholar in Romania. I am a marketing professor and I am going to be talking to you about cultural differences between the US and Romania. My hope is not to bore you about this. I am going to be talking to you about some cultural dimensions and ways that it's a little easier to understand culture. Because if you are like many of us, when you come to Romania, which congratulations on your Fulbright, you will experience some cultural shock. It's a very different way of living and being, and it's something that is only ever going to make you realize not only what we have in the U.S., but also just kind of grow as a person. So, without further ado, So talking today about the cultural differences. When we think about the cultural iceberg, this is something that is a very good visual, and I think it's something that is nice to see. These are things that you'll see that are differences that are, just good topics to have when you're talking to somebody about, oh, how was your trip to Romania? These are going to be the things that are a little bit easier to discuss. So for instance, the food is different here, the language is different, there's different folklore, people dress differently, literature is different, holidays and festivals are different. These are all things that are very, more or less easy and not politically fueled to talk about. Now, on the other hand, these difficult to see beliefs and other areas is much more vast, and that's actually what kind of creates the whole cultural landscape. So I'm not going to be talking to you about all of these things today, but this is just something that's good to keep in mind. Something along the lines of family values and concept of justice, competitiveness, gestures, child rearing practices. All of these things come up, and you'll notice that they're quite different when you're going to be living in Romania in comparison to the U.S. So one of the ways that, and generally speaking, the way we think about culture and how things are different is we measure it by attitudes, beliefs, and values. Attitudes, the actual textbook definition, is the learned tendency to respond in a consistent way to a given object or entity. And what that basically means, to put it much more simply, is it's what you feel, it's your opinion. And so when we start thinking about your opinion of things, then it's the easiest thing that we can actually change with marketing messages and communications. Most of our ads that are out there in anywhere not only are supposed to be helping you gain awareness about the firm and the product, but it's also helping you shift the attitude and different types of associations that you have with that. And so one of the things that we can think about then is that there are lots of different ways that are different between attitudes in the U.S. and Romania. And so, for example, something like recycling in the U.S., it's relatively normal. In Romania, it's catching on, but it's not altogether that easy to find, and it's not really employed altogether that much. And so there's just a different attitude towards saving the world and conservationism. For example, I'm here with my husband and my young son, and my son is still in diapers, and we use cloth diapers. And here it's more or less, that's the only thing poor people do. It's not like the U.S. where you're being an environmentalist and you're being conscious of the environment and about saving money and whatever else. It's pretty much viewed as like, well, you have money, you should be buying disposable diapers. I don't understand why you would want to wash your diapers. So we've had to shift and change our ideas a little bit more. Now, on the other hand, too, the other thing about another attitude is that talking to students about that is slightly different is our attitude towards food and towards eating. So in the U.S., think about how many products that we have that are on the go. We have all these different types of breakfast cereals that are directed towards kids that are running off to school, and we have cereal bars that have milk in them, and everything's always in a consumer easy way of an individual packet to go. So Go-Gurts and individual sized everything. In Romania, that's not really the case. If you talk to a Romanian about the fact that I actually at one point was talking to a Romanian and explained that many Americans, and myself included, have eaten my breakfast in the car on more than one occasion. And the fact that I'm actually to the point where I actually kind of pat myself on the back for not eating in the car and eating at a table, that made the Romanian that I was speaking to very upset. Because here things are just a little bit more relaxed. Eating's more of a family affair, and it's the nutrition behind it. And so that's one thing that's also, it's nice when you start to see these differences in attitudes and beliefs. Now, the next level then is a belief. So the actual textbook definition is an organized pattern of knowledge that an individual holds to be true about the world. So one of the things that we think about that is that these are the opinions that you often have, but are hard to articulate. But they are the things that tend to guide your behavior and speeches. And so what I mean by that is that there are things that we, typically speaking, as a marketer and as a psychologist, we look at things as implicit and explicit beliefs. Implicit beliefs are automatic and conditioned. And so what I mean by that is that if you see something like a recycling can, you're going to put your can right straight in there. And a Romanian who has not necessarily been conditioned to believe in recycling and doesn't have a positive attitude towards recycling isn't going to be recycling automatically. And of course, things are changing, and things change here very rapidly. We're in the middle of moving history, so this might be outdated in a couple of years, but this is just to give you perspective. Things can be conditioned and changed. Now, on the other hand, when we have explicit beliefs, these are beliefs that we have to consciously think about. So it's not just this automatic response. It's something we have to literally think about and think about before we actually say something. So oftentimes when we think about these beliefs, the most common example and easiest to describe is regarding beliefs about racism. So our implicit belief might be that if we see somebody of a different race, we might not like them. But our explicit beliefs is we know that we're not supposed to like them. We don't really have a reason why we don't. So we correct our speech patterns towards them. We would lie if somebody asked us about something. We would correct a lot of these feelings and the implicit beliefs that we have. Now that's all fine and good. These are all good things that we want to happen in society. And these are also things that can occur through marketing. It just takes a lot of time to have these changed. Now one of the things too is that over time, these attitudes and beliefs, particularly towards something like education and something that we're, with the Fulbright, what we're engaged in, are changing. You're going to notice that the students that you have are going to have a difficult time with critical thinking. They're going to have a difficult time asking you for help. They're going to have a difficult time showing up to class. Attendance is very different here. Now, these attitudes and beliefs are things that have occurred over time. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily set in stone. These are just things that you can change and you can modify in the classroom. The beliefs are going to have to be reinforced. There's lots of ways through educational websites, if you look, to see. You can help to give your students little suggestions about how to change things, and also to work towards having the students think a little bit more critically. It's just something that has not been instituted in the educational system as of yet, but things are changing. That's one of the nice things about having an exchange program like the Fulbright, is because when we have people start thinking about critical thinking and coming over to the States and seeing how we talk to our students, things are starting to come back over here into Romania, and they're starting to shift. Now the final area is something that's called a value. And one of the other areas that we think about when we're measuring different types of cultural contexts are values. Now, these are the most difficult to articulate and also the hardest to change. They typically take generations to change. Values are something that are so deep down that we, unless somebody explains it to you, you probably wouldn't even really know. And so if I was to say to you, what do you think is a core American belief? Most of you would probably be like stammering and thinking about I don't know, I have no idea. But if I explained it to you, then you might agree with it. And so there are two core U.S. values that I'm going to be talking about, and the first is self-sufficiency. In the U.S., we are very, very into, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and moving on. We have so many cliches and sayings about this, and we really strongly value you taking care of your own self and not having to rely on the government or on your family members. You have to be able to prove yourself and be individualistic and move forward. Now, on the other thing too is one of the other core value that we have is that hard work gets rewarded. We firmly believe, we love rags to riches stories. Love them. It's one of the, if you look at all the American literature that's out there, that's one of the cute or strong values that we love. We love the fact that we have this upward mobility, and that if you put your hard work in, you're going to get payout at some point. And that's something that we very strongly believe, and it's something that comes up in our storytelling quite a bit. And it's also something that comes across in our brands. Now, and I am not talking about Romania here, I'm talking more about Chinese core values here, because these are much more documented and something that I can stand behind, as opposed to Romanian, which would be something that I would have to, I would be kind of pulling out of, I'd be, not necessarily saying something that has been written by a cultural anthropologist. So now an example of a core Chinese value, just to contrast things a little bit from the States, is that you're either lucky or you're not. And what I mean by this is that there's this belief that you've either been born lucky or you've been born not so lucky. And if you were born lucky, then you're going to have a lot of good things happening in your life. If you weren't born lucky, well, hopefully next time you're born and next time you live, hopefully you'll have a better life. That's one of the ways that that Chinese are able to handle the difference in hierarchy and the fact that everything in life is not fair, is that sometimes when they see that somebody has done really well for themselves, they just believe that they're lucky. And there's lots of fortune telling, and that's one of the things that happens with horoscopes, is that there's lucky years and there's unlucky years. And so there's just a very different aspect in the U.S. That if you were, that you're more or less, you can't change your destiny. The other thing too is that it's also very different between the U.S. and China, is that there's the respect and hierarchy, and then particularly for your elders. And so what I mean by that then is that if you think about it, in the U.S., we like our grandparents, but we're definitely not giving them money or supporting them. Whereas in China, their entire social support system is set up by their kids. There is no social security. That's one of the reasons why they like to have boy babies, is because the boy babies are supposed to be taking care of all of their elders forever. And that's just one of the things that happens, is you believe that your elders have more wisdom and you respect them. In the States, we put them in nursing homes, and it's a little different. And so all of these things do, believe it or not, come out through when you're actually staying and doing a cultural exchange, particularly in an education system. You'll start to notice that there's just some sort of a different value that's going on. So the next thing I'm going to be talking to you about is how the typical way of measuring cultural differences is by a guy named Gert Hofstede. He created this cultural typology. And so I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about the difference between U.S., Romania, and China. And that's just to kind of give you a perspective of how close and how similar are they, are all three cultures. And so if I was to ask you right now, do you think that Romania is closer to the U.S., or do you think that Romania is closer to China as far as the different types of cultural perspectives? I bet you most would probably say probably closer to the U.S. And that's also what Romanians also say. However, you're going to see that in many instances, China and Romania are much more similar than not. And one of the reasons why is because of the socialist perspective that has more or less embedded the value system that is there today. So we're going to be talking about the difference in power distance, individualism, collectivism, masculinity, femininity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. So for instance, there's Graf-Hofstadter's power distance. What this basically means is that we have a way of handling different levels of hierarchy and differences. And so for this, the U.S. and China, and U.S. is pretty low, and China and Romania are pretty high. And that means that there is an understanding and respect for the hierarchy. So you'll see that in this pretty much in your university structure. For example, when you walk into your university in the U.S., the president and dean are generally speaking accessible. You can see this in the fact that the way that their offices are set up, they're usually set up with a window. You can see if they're in there, you can walk by and wave to them. It's not unusual to have a conversation with either any of the deans or anybody who's high up in the university system. They also generally have these open door policies or a meet and greet where you can actually have a one-on-one time with them. Now in Romania and China, there's no way. This does not happen. This was one of the most interesting things to me when I came into the university structure in Romania, is that the deans actually have like 2 doors and like multiple secretaries before you can get to them. And trying to get to the rector, or also known as the president, is even more difficult. They don't have an open door policy. Most students don't even know who the president/rector is. And they have never talked to them. This is just not the way that it's set up. It's a difference in hierarchy. The president's dealing with the president's stuff, and the students are dealing with the student stuff. So one of the other things too is that you're also going to notice that there's a difference in the critical thinking exercises when you give these exercises to your students. The students might be scared to ask you for help, and this is because of the power distance. They just need a little bit more encouragement. They need to understand that they are dealing with somebody who's from a different culture, who does not see this hierarchy as different. And you have to just kind of constantly reinforce this difference and let them know that it's okay and that you're not offending them at all. So the other thing too, the next thing, is individualism, collectivism. And so what we mean by this is that this is basically how are you thinking about your groups. So in the U.S., we're very high as being individualistic, and in Romania, they're very high, and also in China, very high in collectivism. And so the easiest way to think about this is that you're either part of the in-group or you're part of the out-group. So when you're a part of the in-group, people are really nice and super willing to help out. So this could be your family structure, this is the people at school, it could potentially at some point be your neighbors, but it's going to be an actual core group. But when you're part of the out-group, you're more or less a stranger, and they're not going to help you. So there's a little bit more of a reluctance to getting to know you and to wanting to be friends. Now, obviously, everybody has a different story and a different way of handling this. But one of the things that I have noticed is that when you are part of the in-group, it's just so nice because you have people that are actually literally willing to sit down and really help you, whereas in the U.S. it wouldn't be as common because we're a little bit more individualistic. And so what I mean by that is that when you're individualistic, you're going to go back on that core value of self-sufficiency and think to yourself, you can figure it out yourself. Whereas in Romania, it's, okay, let's figure this out together. And I know a guy who knows a guy who can help you get this done. And so that's one of the nice things about being in a collectivistic culture. Although when you're part of the out-group, it's kind of difficult to collect data and to move forward. All right, so masculine, feminine, what does this mean? So this is the extent to which the society stresses achievement or nurturing qualities. As you can see in the U.S. and China, relatively high, not off the charts high. But so because the U.S. is much more masculine than Romania, what it means is that we value achievement much more frequently than Romanians do. Romanians in general have a much more of a nurturing society. And that also means that you're going to see things like in Romania too. So both men and women are supposed to be modest, tender, and concerned with the quality of life. And you're 100% going to notice this. You're going to see that meetings don't really start on time, that people are literally going to be asking you how you're doing, and they actually mean it. They're not just saying it as a pleasantry. And they're going to be a little bit more concerned about making sure that you're not stressed out or sick. Being sick here, you get a lot more sympathy than in the U.S. There also means that in Romania, there's a smaller gender wage gap. It's if I remember correctly from this past year's data, it's like the second or third lowest wage gap in the world. And so that's something that we see too differently, is that because Romania is more of a feminine society, there's just things are a little bit more equal. The other thing too is that conflict is solved through negotiation, not force. So what that means is that if you have a customer service problem, you can't yell at the customer service agent. You have to negotiate, and you have to be very, very calm. Otherwise, they're not going to listen to you. And I mean this because I have dealt with this myself. In the States, we're used to dealing with things through force. I'm going to yell at you, I'm going to insult you, I'm going to insult your product, and I'm going to tell you I'm never going to use your company again. Whereas in Romania, they'll just say, okay, bye-bye. They don't really care because they're more feministic. And, feminine society, not feministic. And so things are a little different. And that also means then, too, is that when you're dealing with your students and when you're negotiating for research, you have to negotiate and you have to learn how to figure these things out. So now with uncertainty avoidance, this is something that, this is where cultures are adapting to changes and coping with uncertainty. This is something that I believe that you're going to see, and this is going to be affecting you and your students more than some of the other areas other than individualism and collectivism. So, for instance, in the U.S., we're okay with ambiguity and vague directions. I mean, obviously, you can easily say, well, that's not very true. I can come up with a certain instance where this is not the case. But what this means is that in general, when dealing with certain types of critical thinking skills, we are fine, not having as many dots being connected as Romanians require. So Romanians, on the other hand, are not as comfortable taking risks. Now, much of this has to do with the communist and the planned society that occurred during the 80s, and it's just something that is kind of getting worn down, and people are starting to get better with uncertainty, but it's still very much there. And so what I mean by this then is that in the U.S. we tend to have more tolerance for diversity. And so because Romania is much more homogenous and it's just Romanians are Romanians, they're a little bit more xenophobic. And you're going to notice that. There's quite a difference. I mean, people have a very strong opinion about minorities in Europe and also in Romania. And they're not afraid to tell you about them, which for me was probably one of the most unsettling areas. Having only lived in the U.S. my entire life, I'm not used to hearing about minorities being talked about in a bad way. But in Romania, it's okay, and it's because oftentimes it's from a cultural perspective. The idea is that it's an uncertainty avoidance. I don't know this group. I don't know them. They're part of the out group, and I don't know. I don't want to figure out who they are or why. Excuse me. So now the other thing too is that there's also this belief that in Romania there's this belief that all teachers have the answer and that learning is much more structured. In the U.S., on the other hand, teachers are okay to say I don't know. In Romania, if you have any experiences like me. I was asked questions that had nothing to do with marketing and something I would have no idea about, but the students were asking me because they saw me as an expert. As much of a compliment as that was, they were not very impressed with my I don't know responses. And so these are things that you're just going to have to explain to your students over time, that they are just going to have to kind of get used to the fact that sometimes you don't know everything, and you're a better person for saying I don't know than just by coming up with a response just to fill the void. So the other thing too is that you're also going to learn that there's, in the U.S., we have a little bit more open-ended learning and discussion. So the way we've always been kind of taught with critical thinking and metacognitive skills is that, we will give students a scenario, and we'll ask them to work it out. Whereas Romanians, for Romanians, that's not, the scenarios are, if they're not perfect, if there's something that they can't actually completely visualize, they have a very difficult time moving forward. And so the only suggestion I have with that is to just keep telling them, like, okay, I understand, yeah, this is difficult, but let's just pretend and let's move forward. And they won't like it, but over time they get used to it and they'll start to understand it. And now, of course, everybody's different, but I think that's one of the things that you're probably going to notice is that when you give students an example that they don't really know about, they're going to be a little bit more hesitant to talk to you about it because they're afraid that they're going to be wrong. So now the other thing too is that with long-term orientation, and this is more or less how we view time in our relationships. So as you can see, the US is really low, Romania is kind of in the middle, and China is much higher. And this is, I think, a good visual, and if you know much about the US and Chinese culture, it kind of gives you a good understanding of how Romania is. So in the US, we have a very short-term orientation pretty much towards everything. That's one of the reasons why, around the world, people kind of make fun of us, at least in particularly Europeans make fun of us, because the U.S. is known for making fast friends. We will make friends with somebody for a short-term goal, and more or less we'll just have a friend for a reason. So if we're on a cruise, we might come across somebody and become friends with them within 2 days, and because we know we're going to be hanging out with them for the next 7 days. And so we're much more likely to be disclosing and talking about all of our life much more quickly than a European would, and in particular a Romanian would. We have just, we kind of view things in a much more short-term perspective than older countries. Now Romania, on the other hand, is a little bit in between, but generally speaking, and in comparison to the U.S., they have more long-term goals. So there's much more of an emphasis on persistence. So you just got to keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. They're not going to be necessarily worried about, perfection. They're going to be worrying about, and emphasizing persistence and just keep trying. The other thing too is that it takes a little bit longer to make friends with somebody here because of it. It just takes a little bit longer to have your students trust you and to be willing to want to come to you and talk to you in a way that students would in the U.S. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's not you. You definitely shouldn't take it personally. It's much more the value system here and the cultural orientation. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with the perspectives of culture between the U.S. and Romania. I wish you a wonderful time in your Fulbright. I think you're going to have a great time, and keep in mind that we are in an amazing time where we're getting to see and experience basically living history, because Romania is exploding so quickly and is changing so rapidly that we're getting to see things moving along within 2-3 years is going to be completely different than it was just even now. So have a wonderful time and good luck.